Hi, I'm Glenn Dakin, writer of the Scooby-Doo Essential Guide, and you're listening to a podcast named Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
The gang's all here, they're on the case, and there's no ghost that they wouldn't face, 'cause they dig it, Scooby-Doo. Yeah, they dig it, Scooby-Doo.
Hey gang, and welcome to the first official episode of A Podcast Named Scooby-Doo for 2018. I hope everybody had a great holiday season and a happy new year, and that everything is kind of settled down and getting back to normal, just like they're settling down and getting back to normal here on the podcast. We're getting back to our interview format after the craziness, absolute craziness that was the holiday special that I put together in December. Super fun, I want to give another shout out to everybody that was involved with that holiday special. You guys were fantastic. Everybody just sort of coming together warmed the cockles of my heart. Huge amount of work, but I think it turned out really well. I've gotten some good feedback on it, so that's fabulous. But, like I said, getting back to basics, getting back to what the show is all about, which is digging into Scooby-Doo history and talking to the folks who've worked on this property, on this franchise. And this month, in our feature interview, I have Supervising Director for Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, Victor Cook, which is really great because I haven't talked to anybody from Mystery Incorporated yet. It was kind of the show that sort of brought me back in to Scooby-Doo. I'd sort of, all the direct-to-video movies, What's New Scooby-Doo, sort of brought me back in at that point, but then I sort of drifted out again, and then Mystery Incorporated sort of sucked me back in. Be Cool's kind of kept me there. We'll see what happens with the next iteration, but yeah, it was great talking to Victor, and he's got a new show, Stretch Armstrong and the Flex Fighters, which dropped on Netflix, I believe in November. So we talked a little bit about that as well, and it's also the 10th anniversary of Spectacular Spider-Man, which he was the supervising director and I believe executive producer on. So we also touched on that just kind of briefly, because I love to not just talk about Scooby-Doo, but also talk about what these folks have done, before and after, and what they're doing right now, getting their stuff out there. So I'm kind of rambling. I feel like it's been a while since I've done this. I feel like I'm kind of getting back on the horse after being away for a long time. I think there's a part of me, there's a podcasting section of my brain that kind of shut down after Christmas. So you'll forgive me if I'm a little all over the place. But rather than listen to me being all over the place, I'm going to start up this interview. We're doing another two-part. Vic and I, we talked for just over an hour, I think. Or at least there's just over an hour of actual interview content that's worth listening to. And as per usual, I'm going to split it into two parts. The first part is all Scooby-Doo. The second part is a blend of Scooby-Doo, Stretch Armstrong, and Spectacular Spider-Man. And I'm hoping to get that up sooner than later. The goal is to have that up in about a week or two. I don't want there to be a huge gap between the two parts. And some more great news. Vic and I are currently just trying to hash out some logistics. We're hoping to get some commentaries. We're hoping to do a commentary or two for Mystery Incorporated. Vic's picked a couple of episodes that he really enjoyed working on. If we can get everything to work out timing-wise, we're going to get that done, and you guys are going to have some more commentaries for a show that's not Be Cool Scooby-Doo. So we're branching out. We're getting bigger and better and wider, and there you go. So without further ado, I'm going to let you guys get to the interview. So kick back, turn up the volume, pop in the earbuds, however you're listening to the show. We'll see you on the other side.
Wait a minute. I think I found a clue. Looks like someone was in a hurry to burn something in the fireplace.
It's an old newspaper clipping. And listen to this.
So we're here with Victor Cook, who is a director on Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. Hello, Victor. Welcome to the show.
Hi, glad to be here.
So is this is for your podcast that we're doing this?
That is
Very
correct,
cool.
yes.
Okay.
It's called A Podcast Named Scooby-Doo.
Okay.
The mission statement is basically, there's almost no history done on this 50-year-old franchise.
I know.
There's some stuff done for like the original series, but beyond that, not really.
I know. It's like it kind of gets overlooked. Like the superhero shows kind of get the spotlight a lot. What's interesting about when I was at Warner Brothers is like the DVDs are about sort of keeping that classic Scooby design style alive.
Right.
And the TV shows are about trying something slightly different each time.
Yeah.
So that's why you'll see a little bit different maybe background style or painting style or radically different character design style depending on what version of the TV show. But the DVDs, for the most part, still look design-wise like the Iwai Takamoto designs from way back,
Yeah, they try and maintain
Yeah.
those original models and style.
I'd say what's different is the way they're storyboarded. They're storyboarded more quote-unquote movie-like now, whereas back then it was very like left to right, the same background panning by,
Right. I actually, I've had some communication with people working or who worked on Be Cool Scooby-Doo, and they were saying kind of the same thing, that the DTVs were like, that was the on-brand Scooby, and the TV shows is where the Warner Brothers was more willing to experiment.
Right.
So, yeah. Now, the first question I generally ask anybody who is a guest on the show is, what is kind of your personal background with Scooby? How did you come to the character? What was sort of your initial series?
Well, the initial series I saw as a kid when it came out was the original, and that was my first introduction to Scooby. And I liked the show. I mean, I noticed even then some of the sort of economic animation tricks they would do, like the same background panning and left to right animation. I always liked the show, and but I was more back then, to be honest, a Johnny Quest, Herculoids kind of a kid. Frankenstein Jr.
I hear that so often.
Frankenstein Jr., Adamant, So, years and years later, when I found myself on Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, it actually was a really good fit because, when they were putting the show together, when I heard about the show, I kind of thought, oh, it's going to be like the Scooby-Doo I remembered. And, and if you've seen the show, in a lot of ways it is. But when I saw the crew being put together, I go, wow, this is kind of eclectic. They have this art director who's just come off of doing these fantastic shows like Samurai Jack and all these great shows like Cartoon Network. His name is Dan Kroll. And then this other director who is like well known for Batman Beyond and Justice League and those kind of things, and his name is Kurt Gaeta. I'm like, wow, these such divergent people on this show, and the writers involved, Mitch Watson, and the other sort of developer of the show and producer, Tony Cervoni, who came from Space Jam, very Looney Tunes Space Jam background. I'm like, wow, and then I just came off the Spectacular Spider-Man, and at first I'm like, how does this all come together? But Tony, who developed the show, had in mind that filmically or cinematically, we were going to kind of do this like as if it were a movie, as opposed to doing sort of the jokes of the background panning forever and things like that. And so it all made sense to me, this crew, and it was a lot of fun, to get going on it.
It was actually one of the most interesting things about that show when it did come out. It's interesting to hear you say that it was kind of approached as a movie. The references you weren't like parodying the original series or anything, because it did have like just such a different color palette, and the background art was just beautiful, and it had I don't want to say maturity, but
I would say it had like depth and layer to it from a story and character perspective. It was like, when I met with Tony and Mitch, one of the things Tony would say to me, remember the 3 Fs. I mean, this is a Scooby thing. Remember the 3 Fs. It's like fear, food, and flashlight. So that's brilliant. And that's to where we're honoring sort of that original Scooby, right? But the layered part is sort of like backstory and characterizations for the characters. So they weren't just sort of like one note anymore. And the fact that, yes, each episode was self-contained as far as who that monster was or who that villain was for that episode, but there were bits of the episodes that can keep continuing to an overall story arc. So you never really saw that in a Scooby. And what I kind of meant also by movie-like was just the way it was storyboarded and staged. We weren't sort of constrained by that idea back when they were doing the original show, trying to do it as economical as possible because it was all done in-house. So we were able to storyboard where it wasn't as flat, and we didn't have to use the same background going by as characters ran. We could have depth to the staging. And the fact that these guys wanted Kurt Gaeta and I to direct, with the sensibilities of the shows we came off of, where action shows do have more depth to the composition and staging, and they really wanted that in the show.
I think the word that I was hunting for was sophistication. Like, there's a sophistication to the look and to the storytelling, which, again, there was a respect for the original source material, but you guys brought something new to it that was really great.
Yeah, I like I said, I have to go back and say the brainchild of that was Tony and Mitch and the team they put together. The color palette that you've mentioned, that's really Dan Kroll, who was our art director in the first season. He came up with the look of the backgrounds. And then in a modern movie way, like when you watch movies, Lord of the Rings or any of these movies, like sequences will have like sort of its color signature, right? Whether it's gold or green or red, and that's how this show was art directed also, by sequences. And I want to mention the character design too. Derek Wyatt was our lead character designer, and he, if you just first glance at the main cast, it looks like the characters from the old designs when you just like look at it. You see it, right? But then you look at it again and you can see, well, no, it slightly has these angles here and there, and it's slightly stylized to really fit in with this kind of background aesthetic. And in a lot of ways, his designs are easier, I think, for the overseas animators to animate kind of on this TV schedule and budget and keep it on model, because it's not all rounded. There's some angles to it.
Right. It's like a familiar silhouette, but the details are...
Yeah, just slightly modernized,
yeah.
Slightly angled up and stylized. So he did a fantastic job. And the stories, dialogue and the stories, Mitch Watson, he's like super hilarious in real life, and he is on the page as well.
Yeah, there was a lot of good writers on that show, like Jim Krieg and Michael Ryan, who had worked on The Real Adventures of Johnny Quest.
Oh, yeah. It was an all-star lineup of writers, for sure, on that show. And, the great cast that had been doing Scooby already for years, and great voice director, Colette Sunderman.
Oh, even beyond, like, the main cast, like the guest stars you got on that show?
Oh, yeah. You're a producer and director in the show, and it's supposed to be you're at work, and but yeah, I found myself geeking out every so often. When we had Tim Matheson come in to play, we reveal he's Fred's real dad, right?
Right.
Season 2, and I think everyone else in the room may have been thinking, or the younger people on the crew may have been thinking, oh, the guy from Animal House, but I was just thinking, that's Johnny Quest. Johnny Quest's in the room, so that was pretty awesome. We had an episode where we had two wizards with George Takei and James Hong sort of play these fantastic wizards. So yeah, it was the guest cast was great.
Now I was curious, what was the mission statement kind of going into production? I know with some other shows, like Warner Brothers will be like, well, we want this one to be funny, or we want this one to be scary. Do you know if the development was kind of free and clear to do sort of what you wanted, or?
I don't know that at any studio you're ever 100% free or clear to do what you wanted.
Well, that's true.
And I have to be honest, I wasn't there during the development of it. It was developed by Tony and Mitch, and
Right.
I got brought on just as we're about to start production. So if there was a mission statement, I don't know what it is. I just know from the direction I got and discussions with Tony and Mitch is sort of like what I've sort of said so far, where it's going to be Scooby in the sense of it's these characters and these tropes, but we're going to add layer and depth to it and make it seem like it's real and not make a joke out of it. So, like the humor really came out of character and personality humor as opposed to sort of like, gags, if that makes any sense. Kind of like if you were to watch Ghostbusters, it was more of a personality character thing rather than a Tex Avery gag or something like that.
So your entry into the show was kind of after all the heavy lifting was sort of done and they were hiring directors?
Yeah, they had developed the show and they're getting ready to go into production, and it was time to crew up. And so Tony had a vision for the show, and like I said, I really could kind of see it when I saw the crew that was coming together. Like, to me, it was like a very eclectic crew. If you didn't know what was in mind to come, you might say, how did these disparate sort of experiences and styles are going to come together in the show? And as you said, it came out very sophisticated and very, very beautiful. Like I said, you had directors who their background were sort of like these action adventure superhero shows, and then you have a guy who art directed at Cartoon Network on Samurai Jack and Foster's Imaginary, that show, and it's just like it all got put together.
Oh, Foster's was such a great show.
so all these like
Samurai
very
Jack.
different elements got put together into this show, which made it like super, super unique.
Mystery Incorporated it's well known for kind of having an 80s horror vibe to it, both sort of in the look and in how the monsters and stuff were sort of portrayed and played out. I thought that was a really inspired way to go, and I was kind of wondering what sorts of influences were drawn on for that look or that tone. Were there specific movies that you were kind of
there were
or?
definitely movies, but as far as like the fashion and things like that, because the show came out in the late, I think, 69 and early 70s, that we sort of like looked at catalogs, and Derek really looked at catalogs, and Dan as well, of what people wore back then and the hairstyles. And so that sort of informed what our incidental characters and background characters and guest stars would look like. So they had that kind of 1970s look to it, even though our show did not take place in the 1970s. So that informed like station wagons, cars, vehicles. Even though it was quote unquote today and contemporary, it was that aesthetic of the 70s.
It's kind of funny because looking back now, it almost feels like you guys beat Stranger Things to the punch for doing like the retro horror.
Yeah, I think so. They're totally copying us. They should give us something for that. But no, I agree. Contemporary show to me was contemporary to the core, but a lot of those, Stranger Things literally took place though in the past. And our show,
True.
We don't really say what decade it takes place in, but we think of it as taking place now. But we just took design cues and aesthetics from the 70s. But we would still have laptops and flat screen TVs and things like that, but we would just have a look of that era.
That is kind of the beauty of the franchise, is that these characters are so, and I don't use the word iconic easily because I think it's an overused word, but I mean, these are kind of iconic characters and archetypes, and you can kind of put them, you can play with the trappings of it in such a way where you can do that sort of timeless setting and tweak the designs a little bit. Or,
definitely. It was super fun.
Now, I couldn't help but notice that you and Kurt are pretty much the only two directors for the run of the show. There's a couple of exceptions. I know Lauren Montgomery came on to do an episode, and I know I'm missing one
Michael
more.
Gogan also did
right.
a few episodes. But yeah.
Was that budgetary, or was that to keep like a continuity or consistency to the show?
I think it was to keep it consistent, and also just the way it was scheduled. Some shows, the way it's scheduled, I mean, you can have the same budget, just depends on how long you have to do it. So if you have less time to do it, you may do a show like that with 3 crews. And then you'd have like 3 storyboard units going at the same time with 3 different directors. This one we just took longer to do, but with 2 crews. And that's why it's basically was 2 directors. And it did keep it consistent, and it did make it less crazy when we were making animatics and editing and spotting, because we were all just on top of each other. So it gave you some breathing room to do some thinking when you got into those phases of it.
Was the process of directing on Mystery Incorporated pretty much the same as any other show, or were there any sort of unique elements to it?
Well, directing, on the one hand, it's directing, and what is different depending on the show is just what I said, depending on the show, like the style and aesthetic of the show. Like, had they at the beginning decided, no, we're going to sort of parody or stylistically do what they did back in the 70s, you would have shifted your whole point of view of how you're going to direct the show. It would have been flatter, wouldn't have been as dimensional, and you would have had a lot more sight gags and people running in the air before they take off and those kind of things, but we didn't go that route. So, whether I'm directing a preschool show or a superhero show or Scooby or, whatever it is, you get into whatever the style of that show is, and then you direct, depending on that episode. I don't know if that was a really great answer, so I'm sorry. Sorry if that sounded so vague, because it's like, yes, directing is directing, and it is, in a way, the same. You approach whatever you're going to do the same in the sense of you read the script, you research it, you get into the style of the show, and then you sort of insert some of your point of view into it to sort of like direct the storyboard artist and the artist to get them to sort of visualize what you want. But the style of how it's going to be on screen, it depends on the style that everyone is setting for the show up front, the way they did this show, it was a real natural, I think, for Kurt and I, because like I said, the staging was pretty much how we would stage it if we were working on Spectacular Spider-Man or Justice League, except for what's different is that's the staging, but the characters and the acting is not like how you would do those shows. The characters and the acting is going to be more broad, because it's these kind of characters, right? So you wouldn't have, if I'm working on Spider-Man, working on Peter Parker, he is not going to emote and have the same body language, broad body language and expressions like, say, Shaggy would, or even like Fred would, who's a straighter character. But even Fred has broader expressions because that's that character. So it was a mix. The staging was a little more action-like, but the acting was a little more broader.
Since it was just, well, again, not just you and Kurt, but since it was mostly you and Kurt kind of working on the show, did you guys kind of work closely together, or did you pretty much have your assignment or your assigned episodes and you just sort of did your own things?
The guy is such a pro. He pretty much directed his show. Tony wanted me on the first season to be the supervising director. So, yes, I did work with Kurt. I looked over his shows, mostly just to make sure we were being consistent with each other, that it would feel like the same show. But he pretty much directed his shows. That was Kurt. I had a hand in some of it. Mostly it was in the post-production. Since as the supervising director, I would edit the shows,
right,
spot it for sound effects, and lock the animatics and those things.
How was the experience of putting the show together? Were you kind of behind the eight ball, or was it a nice, smooth operation?
Boy, from a production point of view, you always have the deadline. You have to meet your dates. But I got to say that the whole crew, Kurt and I, every so often would just be like, "Wow, man, we are like so lucky. We cannot believe how great this show is." Like, we would respond to the scripts first, like, "Oh my God, the writing is so good." A lot of times when you're directing, you feel like you're maybe kind of having to fix things as you're boarding it, but the writing was just so top notch. And then we'd be admiring Dan Krall's background paintings and just like, "Oh, this is so gorgeous," and the character designs by Derek. And then when the animation started coming back, we were just both thinking this is like the best looking thing we had worked on. It was in the tops of what we had personally worked on before. So we were thrilled. I mean, it was, I've been on other shows where it was like a grind, and I just do not remember it that way on this show. It just seemed like it was all fun to me. Working with the storyboard artists, it was fun. They were all getting into the show. Working with Mitch, I'd lock animatics with Mitch. The executives would come in for part of that. They were fun. We would, Tony would come in and with us when we'd lock edit. And I don't know how he had the bandwidth, but the guy would always have great ideas at that stage of how to edit stuff. The Blue Falcon episode?
I was watching that just this evening.
So the Blue Falcon episode, I was like really thrilled to get it, and I'm glad I got it. It was a blast to work on, because you're sort of channeling a little bit of Batman and stuff when you're doing that show. But I remember when we were editing the show, and I thought I had got the editing to where like this is it, and Tony came by and he really liked a lot of it. But there was like this particular scene where there was like this punching going on, and he added like these sort of like 6-frame holds on the impacts, which I hadn't thought of. It's like these little touches like that really make it great. And so it was also great that you're working on the show and you feel you yourself have all this experience, but you learn something from each of the crew. And I kind of learned something that night in editing that I've taken with me onto other shows. So it's it was just like a great experience, working on that show.
One of the things that I've always kind of loved about this show, I've been a Matthew Sweet fan since forever, and when I found out that he did the theme song, that was fantastic. But I kind of wondered who was responsible for directing that title sequence.
Okay, so the main titles, that was myself and Dan, where they let us sort of board that out. And it's like we had so many panels at first. We had like all these ideas, and but this main title was, I think, the first main title I worked on that was only 30 seconds long. The trend in main titles, they were shrinking, The first main title that I directed was the one for Spectacular Spider-Man, and it was like a 1-minute main title, and you got to sort of highlight all these different things. And this one was 30 seconds long, and we needed to sort of introduce each of our leads with sort of a visual motif of them, but we wanted to do even more and kind of get into the show. But as you see it just really pretty much ended up being like each character and its motif. So we decided, okay, we're going to do this with like fluid camera moves. That was the way to do it. So, Fred's in the traps, so you see the blueprint of traps behind him, and the camera's going around him, and each character. And probably the hardest one was the one that gets you into it when you see the mystery machine zoom by, and then the camera kind of swoops into the front and then inside to behind the characters, then into Velma's laptop to where you see Fred. That's kind of almost like a CG live action camera move, and it looks, 2D. It blends well with our 2D. And the way that was actually pulled off is Overseas did do the basic skeleton of that whole scene with characters in CG, and then they printed out each frame and then drew the characters over it so it would match.
Interesting.
The mystery machine, by the way, in the series is a CG toon shader element. But yeah, doing the main title was Dan and I, are credited with that. But I got to say, I think Kurt, Gata, and Doug Murphy also jumped in. I think we each did a character motif, So it was a team effort.
I kind of feel like title sequences, a lot of people take them for granted because they're not part of the show. They're just that introductory sort of thing. But I mean, a lot of work goes into them, and there's some really interesting title sequences out there. And your guys' it's short, it's punchy, it's very succinct. It shows you all the characters. It's just really well done. So I just wanted to give you guys props for that.
Oh, thanks. And I should little backstory is before Dan and I sat down to do it, there's a lot of discussion with various executives at Warner Brothers and Tony. So we're hearing, it's a lot of brainstorming. So a lot of teamwork went into it.
Now, another thing that made the show unique was its narrative structure and its 2-season arc. And I was curious, especially the way the show ended. Do you know if there were thoughts about continuing beyond 2 seasons, or was that always the plan from the beginning?
Well, you're going to probably have to see if you can get Mitch or Tony to answer this part accurately. But from my perspective, this thing was designed to be basically when you get to that last episode, you realize this is the prequel to the original series, right? Because at the end of the last episode, now they got to drive cross country, right? And that's what that original show was. They were stopping from town to town, solving mysteries.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. So this is the prequel. This whole series was set up to be like the prequel of that original show. So I don't know that we were going to do our version of the original show after that. That's something, hopefully you can never get one or both of those two guys as a guest one day and they can tell you.
I'll certainly try.
Yeah.
I remember after watching that episode and just imagining what it would be like to have, potentially Harlan Ellison as a continuing sort of thing in the show. Like, he was so great in that episode, that Chargar Gothicon one.
Oh yeah,
Shrieking Madness, that's what it was called.
Shrieking Madness, yeah, he was such a character in the room at the record as well. Yeah, it was a blast, definitely.
And Jeffrey Combs's Hatecraft was like fabulous too.
Oh yeah, yeah. They were both there at the same record. There's a picture of me and Mitch posing with them. I have it somewhere. It was great.
Actually, that's a question I didn't think of asking until you just mentioned that.
Mm-hmm.
Was the record generally done with as many people around as kind of possible for the scenes, or? Yeah,
I've been on shows where they will bring in one actor at a time, and then I guess it gets edited together later. This show was done similarly to when I did the Spectacular Spider-Man, where you brought as much of the cast in at the same time so they could play off each other. Now, not everybody's there all at the same time, but the majority are there at the same time.
If they were playing scenes against each other, you tried to have them in the same order.
You know, if there was an incidental guest star who maybe only had 2 or 3 minutes of screen time, you try to schedule them in there while the leads are there. The leads tend to be there almost the whole session, and then the guest stars, maybe they're only there for an hour or hour and a half. So the majority of the time, you try to get them together so they could play off each other. It wasn't always possible with the guest stars, but definitely with our leads, who played Fred and Shaggy, Velma, Daphne, Scooby, they were always pretty much there at the same time.
Now, the show always kind of had a darker tone to it, but as it progressed, it hit some pretty dark moments, like what happens with Marcy and Angel.
Yeah.
Was that considered kind of a dangerous thing to try, or were you guys like it just fit the story, or
it fit the story that we wanted to tell,
or you knew that it was going to reset at the end, so it was kind of, you had a safe out there?
Well, interesting how you lay out the question. For us, this is the story we wanted to tell. This was the tone we wanted to tell. You're watching this show, and at first you think it's a Scooby-Doo show that you've seen before, where the masks come off, and it's a person in a mask, and then you start to slowly realize, no, some of these are not masks; they are real monsters, or real evil. Until you get to that last season, and it's like, wow, it's not just people pretending to be monsters, it's monsters, until it resets. It's what we wanted to tell. Now, if there was a danger to that from, say, higher above us, I don't know. I have not heard that, So it seemed like everybody loved the show, and it was supported.
So it was supported by the network. They liked it.
Well, I think the fans liked it. The network seemed like they were always moving us around, which I guess you can't take that as meaning they like you or don't like you, but you kind of wish your show would stay in the same spot at the same time. But they liked us enough to where we got 52 episodes, so that was great. And I know when we went on Netflix, we were one of their highest rated shows while we were there. So, and the fan response has been huge. I mean, I've read and seen on a few of the sites when fans sort of rank all the various Scooby-Doo shows. I mean, I'm just repeating what I read. It's not me saying this, but it seems like it comes out on top. So I think we did something right with this show.
I know Mystery Incorporated was kind of my re-entry to the show. I'd watched What's New, kind of drifted after Shaggy and Scooby-Doo came out, and I don't even know if I knew that Mystery Incorporated had come out. I think I caught it like a few episodes after it came out, and I was like, oh, there's a new Scooby-Doo, and I watched it, and it just drew me in. It was so different and so interesting to look at, and like I said, it was so much more sophisticated. I didn't think anybody would try and do Scooby-Doo with any kind of degree of, I guess, respect is the word. It's played so much for gags and parody, and you look at the live action movie and everyone's leaning into the, all the silliness and the over the top stuff that's kind of just gotten into the perception of what Scooby-Doo and those characters are. And you guys, it felt like you sort of distilled something from that original, 69 series, and we're like, no, these are real people, and they're interesting people, and it's a group dynamic, and they all have a purpose. No one's unnecessary, and I think Go ahead.
I think you're describing it exactly right. It was sort of like, I think the characters are sort of archetypes, right? Of like the pretty one or the smart one or the goofy, like that, and they still are those, but it was like, but they're more than that. You kind of go underneath the levels and see layers of the personality, and so you realize, okay, you're not just that, you're a little bit beyond, more than that. I'm glad it resonated, and the other thing is, like, by adding these layers, what we wanted to do is, like, we still wanted to make a Scooby-Doo show that kids would love. So we just wanted this to work on two levels, So it's still, if you're a 6-year-old kid and never saw Scooby, or even if you had saw Scooby, this would still recognizably be Scooby-Doo, right? Just like I said earlier, when Tony discussed with me, like, the 3 Fs, make sure we got the 3 Fs: fear, food, and flashlights.
Yeah.
So we have that and the humor with the personalities of the characters, but that other aspect, as you described, as sophisticated, whether it's the art direction style or the writing and the layers of the personality, that brings in, someone like you to come in and appreciate it. So it's like we kind of try to make this an all-audience sort of fun, a show for everybody.
And if you can successfully create that, not to disparage in-and-out, one-and-done kind of shows and plot lines. I mean, the new show, Be Cool, Scooby-Doo, I think is also fantastic, and that's kind of its shtick. But that continuing narrative that you guys had, where you're not just invested, in the characters and the franchise, but you're also invested in this story, which is slowly unraveling, and the mystery. Each episode has a mystery, but then there's like this bigger mystery, and like I think that's what really kind of sucked people in. Just that combination, that soup that was just really great to.
I agree. And I tell you, that sucked me in to want to work on the show too. That this is beyond what I originally first thought when I heard through the grapevine, hey, they're doing a Scooby-Doo show. They're crewing up for a Scooby-Doo show. I had that preconception in my head of like, oh, and it was so gratifying to hear that was gonna be this, So it's like, as an audience, I'm glad people received it and liked it. But I'm saying from the other side of it, wow, it felt like really this meaty thing you really wanted to get your hands onto. It was like fun to work on.
It was cool, like, catching on to it, too, and following it as it was running, because you could, tell your friends that one of the best shows on TV is Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, exactly.
And with that, I bring to a close part 1 of my interview with supervising director and producer of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, Victor Cook. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I certainly enjoyed talking to Victor. If you want to keep up to date on Victor's goings-on, you can find him on Twitter at Victor_Cook1. And he's usually posting about the new show, Stretch Armstrong and the Flex Fighters, which we don't talk about in part 1, but we will talk about in part 2. That's Victor's new show. He's very excited about it. He's very proud of the work that they're doing on that show. It is exclusively on Netflix, so check that out if you like anything that Victor's done in Scooby-Doo land, or if you just like superhero and action-oriented animated series. There's a lot there that's familiar, there's a lot there that's not. So it's a nice mix. And if you want, we can consider it a homework assignment between now and when I drop part 2 of the interview, which I'm hoping to do, as I said in the intro, in about a week, maybe 2, depends on time, but I definitely want to get it out before my usual release time, which is the tail end of the month, where I'm hoping to have another interview with another great Scooby-Doo personality. As much as I appreciate the gaps in between episodes, I am kind of feeling like it's maybe too long. So I'm going to experiment a little bit. Oh, and the commentary that John Colton-Berry, Nick Robes from What's With You, Scooby-Doo, and myself, that was part of the holiday special. I'm going to be doing a special release that's isolating that audio commentary so that people don't have to sift through all 2 hours of the holiday special, and they can just sit down and play that over the episode, Scary Christmas. So expect that, expect part 2 of the interview, and expect another interview with another Scooby-Doo personality coming at the end of the month if everything goes according to plan. I'm probably testing fate by speaking so confidently about this. Everybody out there, knock wood, cross your fingers. If you want to get in contact with me or just want to comment on the show, feel free to hit me up on my Facebook page. I'm on Twitter at ScoobyDooCast. Spend a lot of time on Twitter. There's also a blog, which I've been neglecting, but I plan to get back to shortly. I review comic books there. There's some articles, but it's more comic book reviews than anything else. And if you get the show off of iTunes, please, while you're there, support the show, rate and review the podcast. When you do that, it gets the podcast into the eyes and ears of people who may not be subscribing to the show. So, growing the audience, it's a great thing. Getting the attention, it's wonderful. There's also the YouTube channel. You can get the podcast on YouTube, on all the social media. Like, follow, subscribe. If you really enjoy the show, feel free to share among family and friends. Word of mouth is the best way to spread the joy that is A Podcast Named Scooby-Doo. And 2018, I'm really hoping to sort of grow the show a little bit, take it maybe to another level. And so look forward to having all you guys along for the ride. As always, thank you so much for listening. You guys are the best. I'll have any updates on part 2 on Twitter. Until then, we'll see you next time. Take care, and remember,
Jinkies is not actually a word.
Everybody cheer! This is how we solve the mystery. This is how we solve the mystery. So in summation, this narration's my donation to the art of mystery solving dictation. And here's what the bad guys say when they play where the law forbids.
Would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling kids.
This is how we solve the mystery. Bye.